My husband ignored my messages all day. At midnight, he finally came home and smirked. You know what happened. I had a one-night stand with my boss, and I would do it again. I just nodded and finished my meal in silence. The next morning, when he woke up expecting coffee in bed, he got a reality check that would tear his entire world apart. I sat at the dining room table for 4 straight hours before he walked through the front door. The roasted salmon I had prepared for our 6-year anniversary dinner had gone completely cold. The garlic butter had congealed on the fine china, the same china my grandmother had gifted us on our wedding day. I did not shed a single tear as I watched the clock on the wall tick past 10, then 11, and finally midnight. When the front door finally clicked open, Trevin did not stumble or try to sneak in quietly. He walked into the foyer with the heavy, arrogant footsteps of a man who believed he owned the world. I was wearing one of the custom Italian suits I had paid for, the fabric tailored perfectly to his broad shoulders. The heavy scent of expensive bourbon and unfamiliar floral perfume rolled off him in waves, filling our pristine living room. He tossed his keys onto the console table, loosened his silk tie, and finally turned to look at me, sitting alone in the dim light of the dining room. There was no guilt in his eyes. There was no hesitation. He leaned against the granite kitchen counter, crossed his arms over his chest, and delivered his confession with a cruel, satisfied smirk. He told me he had spent the evening at a luxury hotel downtown with Vanessa. Vanessa was the senior executive at the tech firm where Trevin worked as a sales director. She was 42, incredibly wealthy, and known for her ruthless corporate takeovers. Trevon spoke her name with a kind of reverence that made my stomach turn. He looked me directly in the eyes and said he was tired of coming home to a woman who only cared about spreadsheets and numbers. He said Vanessa understood his ambition, understood what it meant to be a powerful player in the tech industry. He told me the affair had been going on for months, and that tonight he finally realized he did not regret a single moment of it. He waited for the explosion. I could see the anticipation in his posture. He wanted me to scream. He wanted me to throw the cold plates against the wall. He wanted me to break down sobbing, begging him to tell me why I was not enough, pleading with him to stay and work on our marriage. He wanted the angry, hysterical reaction so he could justify his betrayal, so he could tell himself that I was the problem, and he was simply escaping a miserable home life. I denied him that satisfaction. I picked up my fork, took the last bite of my cold salmon, chewed it slowly and swallowed. I picked up my linen napkin, wiped the corners of my mouth, and stood up from the table. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the soft scraping of my chair against the hardwood floor. I gathered my plate and my glass, walked past him into the kitchen, and turned on the faucet. Trevin pushed himself off the counter, his smug expression faltering into genuine confusion. He followed me to the sink, his voice rising in frustration as he demanded to know if I had even heard a word he just said. He taunted me, calling me cold, calling me a robot, asking if I even had a heart beating inside my chest. I did not look at him. I methodically rinsed the plate, placed it in the dishwasher, and dried my hands on a towel. Without uttering a single syllable, I walked past him, went into the guest bedroom, and locked the door behind me. As I sat down at the small desk in the guest room and opened my laptop, my mind was not on his cruel words. My mind was on the numbers. I am a senior forensic corporate auditor. I spend my days contracting with the Securities and Exchange Commission, tracing missing millions, dismantling shell companies, and hunting down white-collar criminals who think they are smarter than the system. For 6 years, Trevon had mocked my career. He called me a boring bean counter. I told his friends I lacked the visionary mindset required for real wealth. Yet it was my boring, stable 6-figure income that paid the mortgage on our luxury home in Atlanta. It was my credit score that secured the loans for his flashy cars. It was my relentless hard work as a Black woman navigating the treacherous waters of corporate finance that funded his entire startup lifestyle. He chased tech deals that never materialized, living large on my dime while making me feel small and invisible. What Trevin did not know was that I had already discovered his affair 3 weeks ago. I did not find out by checking his text messages or smelling perfume on his collar. I found out the way I find out everything. I followed the money. While reviewing our joint tax documents last month, I noticed a minor discrepancy in a routine transfer. It was a tiny thread, almost invisible, but I am paid to pull threads. I dug into the routing numbers. I bypassed his flimsy password protections. I spent 3 weeks conducting a shadow audit on my own husband. I discovered the hidden bank accounts in the Cayman Islands. I traced the massive unexplained wire transfers funneling into a shell company registered under his name. And I found the frequent exorbitant charges at high-end downtown hotels, luxury jewelers, and exclusive restaurants, all billed to corporate cards authorized by Vanessa. Trevin thought he was a genius. He thought his private accounts were completely untraceable. He did not realize he was married to a woman who dissects complex financial fraud for the federal government. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the glow of my encrypted laptop and went to work with cold mechanical precision. I finalized the massive digital portfolio of evidence I had been compiling. I drafted a comprehensive anonymous whistleblower report detailing severe financial irregularities, unexplained offshore transfers, and suspected tax evasion linked directly to Trevon's personal accounts. I routed the encrypted dossier directly to my contacts at the Internal Revenue Service. Because the amounts involved triggered federal thresholds, the automated response was instantaneous. A temporary freeze was placed on his hidden assets pending an aggressive full-scale audit. Then I logged into our property management portal. The house was solely in my name, a non-negotiable term I had insisted upon when we bought it despite his bitter complaints. I accessed the smart home security system and removed his biometric access. I opened the vehicle management app for the luxury electric sedan he drove. The loan was in my name, the registration was in my name, and the digital key was tied to my master account. With one tap of my finger, I revoked his driving privileges. The car in the driveway was now nothing more than a very expensive paperweight to him. When the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of pale pink and gold, I quietly unlocked the guest room door. I could hear Trevon snoring heavily in the master bedroom down the hall, sleeping off the bourbon and his own arrogance. I walked into his massive walk-in closet. I took down the velvet blazers, the tailored Italian trousers, the silk ties, and the designer shoes. The clothes I had worked 80-hour weeks to pay for. I packed every single item of his clothing into thick, industrial black trash bags. I dragged the bags out to the garage and loaded them into the trunk of my SUV. I planned to drop them off at a charity donation center on my way to the office. When he woke up, he would find his closet entirely empty, leaving him with absolutely nothing to wear but the rumpled suit he had slept in. I returned to the kitchen and placed a thick, heavy manila folder squarely in the center of the kitchen island. Inside the folder were 3 documents. The first was a ruthlessly drafted divorce petition entirely protecting my assets and offering him absolutely nothing. The second was a printout of the offshore shell company he thought he had hidden, highlighting the exact routing numbers and the massive amounts of money he had been funneling through it. The third was a certified copy of the federal notice informing him that his primary and hidden bank accounts had been legally frozen by the government due to an active investigation. I brewed my morning coffee, the rich aroma of the dark roast filling the kitchen. I poured it into my travel mug, picked up my briefcase, and walked out the front door. I locked the deadbolt and walked to my SUV. As I backed out of the driveway, I saw the lights flick on in the master bedroom on the second floor. A few moments later, the front door flew open. Trevin stumbled out onto the porch barefoot, wearing only his wrinkled suit trousers. His eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated panic. He held the manila folder in his shaking hands. He sprinted toward the driveway, realizing his digital key was not unlocking his car. Realizing his clothes were gone. Realizing the money he thought he had stolen was locked behind a federal firewall. He screamed my name, his voice cracking with desperation and terror as it echoed down the quiet suburban street. He begged me to stop the car. He shouted that it was a mistake, that we needed to talk, that he could explain everything. I did not hit the brakes. I did not even look at him in the rearview mirror. I took a slow, deep sip of my hot coffee, turned the steering wheel, and drove toward the city in absolute profound peace. The drive into downtown Atlanta had never felt so smooth. The morning traffic usually tested my patience, but today, watching the city skyline rise against the dawn, I felt nothing but a profound, unshakable calm. My phone sat in the cup holder, its screen lighting up in rapid succession. Trevin was calling. First once, then twice, then a relentless stream of incoming calls that I simply let ring out into the silence of my luxury SUV. When he realized I was not going to answer, the text messages began pouring in. I pulled into the secure underground parking garage of my firm. My company was not a standard tax preparation agency. We were elite forensic auditors contracted directly by the Securities and Exchange Commission and various federal task forces. My clearance level required me to pass through 3 biometric security checkpoints before I even reached my desk. As I settled into my ergonomic chair and booted up my encrypted workstation, the voicemails from Trevon began to populate my inbox. I put on my noise-canceling headphones, pressed play, and listened to the real-time destruction of a narcissist. The first voicemail was exactly what I expected. His voice was thick with arrogance, dripping with the entitled rage of a man who believed he held all the power. He demanded to know where his custom suits were. He screamed about the digital key to his car being revoked. He laughed bitterly into the receiver, telling me that a petty divorce petition did not scare him. He bragged that Vanessa had corporate lawyers on retainer who would crush me in mediation, that I would walk away with absolutely nothing. I deleted the message and played the second one. The tone had shifted entirely. There was a slight tremor of confusion beneath his anger. He demanded to know why his platinum credit cards were declining. He said he had tried to book an exclusive ride service to the office, but the payment method tied to his private Cayman Island account was registering as invalid. He ordered me to unlock the joint accounts immediately, claiming he had an important tech sales pitch that morning and could not afford to look foolish. I deleted that message too. The third voicemail, left only 15 minutes later, was pure, unadulterated terror. The arrogance was completely gone, replaced by the frantic, breathless panic of a man who realized the floor had just fallen out from under him. He was hyperventilating. He stammered that he had called the bank, and the automated system informed him of a federal hold on all his assets. He begged me to answer the phone. He asked what I had put in that manila folder. He screamed that the Internal Revenue Service had frozen the shell company he set up with Vanessa. He pleaded with me to call off the audit, sobbing that Vanessa would literally destroy him if her corporate embezzlement was exposed to the federal government. I took off my headphones, letting his desperate pleas fade into the quiet hum of my office. He wanted a one-night stand with his wealthy boss. He wanted the thrill of corporate espionage and stolen investor funds. Now he was going to experience the full weight of federal consequences. I spent the next 3 hours completely immersed in my work. I analyzed financial discrepancies for a massive healthcare conglomerate, tracing missing funds with clinical precision. I did not shed a tear over my dead marriage. Trevon had systematically killed my love for him over 6 years of financial abuse and emotional manipulation. Today was simply the day I buried it. By 11 in the morning, I decided to take a break. I grabbed my coat and walked across the bustling downtown plaza to my favorite upscale coffee shop. The aroma of freshly ground espresso and warm pastries filled the air as I stepped inside. I approached the counter, ordered a matcha latte, and moved to the waiting area near the large front windows. That was when I heard my name. It was not a friendly greeting. It was a sharp, loud bark designed to draw attention. I turned around and saw my mother-in-law Brenda marching through the front doors of the coffee shop. She was flanked by Sarah Trevon's white sister-in-law, who was married to his older brother Malik. Brenda was wearing a lavish cashmere coat that I knew for a fact was purchased using funds Trevon had siphoned from our joint savings account last winter. Sarah stood beside her, clutching a luxury designer handbag, radiating a smug, passive-aggressive energy that I had endured at family gatherings for years. Trevon had clearly weaponized his family. He must have called his mother in a panic, spinning a narrative that painted me as a vindictive, crazy woman trying to ruin his life out of pure jealousy. Brenda marched right up to me, ignoring the stares of the other patrons in the coffee shop. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest. She loudly announced that I was a bitter, cold woman who was trying to destroy her son just because he found happiness somewhere else. She told me that if I had been a warmer wife, if I had paid more attention to my husband instead of burying my nose in boring tax files all day, Trevon would not have had to seek comfort in the arms of a truly successful woman like Vanessa. Brenda declared that Trevon was a brilliant salesman with a visionary mind, and that I was dragging him down with my ordinary mundane lifestyle. I stood perfectly still, letting her hurl insults in the middle of the crowded cafe. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my career. I simply looked at the cashmere coat she was wearing, recognizing the exact financial transaction that had funded it. Sarah stepped forward, a condescending smirk playing on her lips. She placed a hand on her hip and leaned in close. She told me I needed to drop the angry black woman routine because it was embarrassing for everyone involved. She said I was making a fool of myself by trying to freeze Trevon out. She leaned closer and whispered that I was out of my depth. She bragged that Malik and Trevon had already spent the morning speaking to a wealth management firm. She claimed they were actively transferring all the family assets into secure trusts that I could never touch. She told me I should just accept a meager settlement, sign the divorce papers quietly, and walk away before the family completely ruined me. The barista called my name, placing my matcha latte on the pickup counter. I reached into my purse, pulled out a crisp $20 bill, and handed it to the barista. I told him to pay for whatever Brenda and Sarah were ordering and to keep the change. I picked up my warm cup, turned back to my in-laws, and offered them a calm, chilling smile. I looked Sarah directly in the eyes and thanked her for the advice. I told her I found it fascinating that she and Malik were so confident about protecting the family assets. I wished them the absolute best of luck with their financial planning. Without waiting for a response, I walked out of the coffee shop, leaving them standing there in stunned, confused silence. I crossed the street and got back into my luxury SUV. I locked the doors, set my coffee in the cup holder, and pulled out my cell phone. Sarah and Brenda believed they held all the power. They believed the sprawling 3-story luxury townhouse they lived in was the crown jewel of the family portfolio. Brenda loved to host lavish dinner parties there, showing off the marble countertops and the rooftop terrace to her high society friends. Sarah and Malik lived there rent-free, basking in the illusion of generational wealth. They thought Brenda owned that townhouse outright. They thought it was a family heirloom, completely immune to my divorce proceedings. They had no idea that 2 years ago, Brenda had secretly faced foreclosure after falling victim to a predatory lending scheme. She had been too ashamed to tell her sons. To save the family from public humiliation, I had quietly intervened. I used my pristine credit and substantial bonuses to buy the deed to that townhouse directly from the bank. I set up a shadow limited liability company to hold the property, allowing Brenda to continue living there while preserving her pride. I had paid the property taxes, the maintenance fees, and the homeowner association dues for 24 months without ever asking for a single word of gratitude. I dialed the direct number to my property management firm. My account manager answered on the second ring. I kept my voice entirely professional and devoid of emotion. I instructed him to terminate the grace period on the Atlanta townhouse immediately. I authorized him to draft and deliver a formal 30-day eviction notice to the residents occupying the property. I requested that the notice be delivered via certified courier before the end of the business day. I wanted Brenda and Sarah to be sitting in that beautiful stolen living room when a process server knocked on the front door and handed them the legal documentation, proving they were nothing more than non-paying tenants residing in a house owned by my corporate entity. I ended the call, placed the phone back in my purse, and started the engine. Trevon thought he could replace me with a corrupt executive. Brenda thought she could publicly shame me to protect her golden child. Sarah thought she could intimidate me with racist microaggressions and empty threats about family wealth. They had all severely underestimated the woman they had spent 6 years treating like a footnote. I pulled out of the parking structure and headed back to my office, fully prepared to dismantle their entire reality, one forensic audit at a time. They thought they were untouchable, safe inside the walls of their luxury home. They had no idea that I held the power to shatter their entire reality with a single phone call. The drive back to the firm was a masterclass in emotional compartmentalization. I navigated the heavy Atlanta traffic with the quiet precision of a woman who had just set a ticking time bomb under her abusers. The morning sun glared off the windshield, but my mind was entirely focused on the digital tracking app on my phone. The courier service I used for high-priority legal documents offered real-time GPS updates. Right now, a certified process server was driving a sleek black sedan up the winding tree-lined streets of Buckhead, heading straight for the wrought iron gates of the townhouse. I let my mind wander back to that property for a moment. 2 years ago, Brenda had come to my apartment in the middle of the night, weeping uncontrollably. Malik had convinced her to leverage the house for a commercial loan to fund a luxury car rental business that went spectacularly bankrupt in less than 6 months. The bank was threatening foreclosure. Brenda was terrified of the public shame, terrified that her high society friends from church and her country club would find out she was broke. Trevin had conveniently claimed he was too tied up in his own startup investments to help his mother. So I stepped in. I used my pristine credit, my annual corporate bonus, and a fiercely negotiated shadow limited liability company to buy the deed directly from the bank. I saved her dignity. I kept the roof over her head. And how did she repay me? She moved Sarah and Malik into the master suite, allowed them to live rent-free on my dime, and spent the next 2 years telling anyone who would listen that I was a cold career-obsessed disappointment who did not know how to treat a man. Sarah had spent the last 24 months strutting around those hardwood floors, hosting lavish brunches, claiming the property was an untouchable piece of generational wealth that she had married into. The sheer audacity of her entitlement was staggering. My phone buzzed softly in the passenger seat, pulling me out of my thoughts. The GPS tracking app updated with a bright green notification. The document had been successfully delivered and signed for. I smiled, a slow, deep breath filling my lungs. Right at this very second, Brenda and Sarah were standing in the marble foyer of a house they did not own, staring at a 30-day eviction notice mandated by the state of Georgia. The illusion of their generational wealth had just evaporated into thin air. I pulled into the secure underground parking garage of my firm. My company was a fortress of financial intelligence. We did not just balance corporate ledgers. We were an elite task force of forensic auditors contracted directly by the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Department of Justice, and various federal oversight committees. Our job was to tear apart the financial fabric of corrupt corporations, trace hidden offshore accounts, and build bulletproof cases against white-collar criminals. Passing through the 3 biometric security checkpoints to reach my floor always gave me a sense of profound purpose. I walked past the rows of glass-walled offices, the hushed conversations of senior analysts, and the rhythmic clicking of keyboards. I set my purse down on my desk, hung my coat over the back of my ergonomic chair, and woke up my encrypted workstation. Before I could even open my first case file of the day, my personal cell phone vibrated violently against the wood of my desk. It was a text message from Trevon. He had finally stopped leaving frantic, sobbing voicemails about his frozen bank accounts. It seemed he had run out of tears and gone straight to his only remaining lifeline. He had run to Vanessa. I unlocked the screen and opened the message. It was an image file. The photograph showed Trevon and Vanessa sitting in what looked like the private executive lounge of her tech company. The city skyline loomed massive and bright behind them through floor-to-ceiling windows. They were both holding crystal flutes filled with expensive champagne, clinking their glasses together toward the camera lens. Trevon was wearing a spare suit he must have kept at the office, his posture oozing a forced, desperate arrogance. Vanessa sat beside him wearing a sharp designer blazer, her lips curled into a vicious, predatory smirk. Beneath the image was a typed caption: "You should have just taken the quiet exit. Have fun in the unemployment line." I stared at the screen, my analytical mind instantly dissecting the threat. Trevon had realized he was financially paralyzed. His credit was ruined, his secret offshore accounts were locked behind a federal firewall, and he had likely just received a hysterical phone call from his mother screaming about the eviction notice. Cornered and desperate, he had convinced Vanessa to use her immense corporate power to crush me. Vanessa was a titan in the tech industry. Her company moved hundreds of millions of dollars in venture capital every quarter. She was accustomed to crushing her enemies with a single phone call, using her wealth as a blunt instrument to silence anyone who stood in her way. She thought I was just an ordinary disposable accountant. She thought she could snap her fingers and strip me of my livelihood. My desk phone rang, the sharp, shrill tone cutting through the quiet hum of my workspace. I glanced at the caller ID. It was the internal extension for the managing partner of the firm. Elias was a 50-year-old African-American man who had built this forensic accounting empire from the ground up. He was sharp, unyielding, and completely immune to corporate bullying. He was a man who demanded absolute perfection and absolute integrity from every single auditor on his payroll. I picked up the receiver. His voice was low and gravely. He asked me to come up to the corner office immediately. I did not panic. I smoothed the front of my tailored skirt, locked my computer terminal, and walked down the long carpeted hallway toward the executive suites. The walk felt incredibly long. I knew exactly what Vanessa had done. She was a major player in the tech sector, and her company held a massive multi-million-dollar contract with our firm for annual compliance auditing. She had weaponized that contract. She had called Elias directly, threatening to pull her entire corporate account and ruin the firm's quarterly projections unless I was immediately terminated and discredited. She was trying to frame me for unprofessional conduct, likely spinning a narrative that I was a jealous, unstable wife trying to leverage corporate data for personal revenge. I reached the heavy mahogany doors of the corner office. Elias' assistant gave me a tight, sympathetic nod and pressed the button to unlock the door. I stepped inside. The office was vast, lined with leather-bound legal volumes and federal regulatory manuals. Elias sat behind his massive desk, his hands steepled under his chin. He did not look angry. He looked incredibly serious, his dark eyes analyzing me with the intensity of a predator calculating a strike. He gestured for me to sit in the leather chair opposite him. I did not waste time with pleasantries. He told me that he had just concluded a very unpleasant 30-minute phone call with the chief executive officer of one of their largest tech accounts. He stated that Vanessa had demanded my immediate termination. He recounted her threats with a clinical detachment, explaining that she had accused me of corporate espionage, of harassment, and of being a dangerous liability to their financial privacy. She had given Elias an ultimatum: fire me by noon, or she would pull a $20 million compliance contract from our firm and drag our reputation through the mud in the financial press. I sat perfectly straight, keeping my hands folded calmly in my lap. I did not interrupt him. I did not rush to defend myself. I knew that in this room raw emotion was a weakness. Only facts mattered. Elias finished his summary and leaned back in his chair. He looked at me, waiting for my reaction. I looked him directly in the eyes. I told him that my husband had been engaging in a long-term affair with Vanessa. I told him that I had filed for divorce that morning. And then I laid my final card on the table. I told him that while securing my personal assets, I had noticed severe, highly sophisticated financial irregularities funneling from Vanessa's corporate accounts directly into offshore shell entities registered under my husband's name. I stated that Vanessa was not trying to fire me out of romantic jealousy. She was trying to fire me because she was terrified of what I had found in her ledgers. Elias did not blink. The silence in the office was so heavy it felt tangible. He slowly unsteepled his hands, reached into the deep drawer of his desk, and pulled out a thick red classified dossier. He placed the dossier squarely on the polished mahogany wood between us. He looked at me and said that Vanessa had made a fatal, catastrophic miscalculation. She assumed our firm was just a standard tax agency, desperate to keep her money. She did not realize that when a corporate executive aggressively demands the termination of a federal forensic auditor without providing legally verifiable proof of misconduct, it automatically triggers a mandatory internal review of that executive's financial standing. Elias tapped the red dossier with his index finger. He told me that instead of firing me, he was officially promoting me. He slid the heavy file across the desk. He informed me that as of this exact moment, I was the lead investigator on a sudden, full-scale, unannounced federal audit of Vanessa's entire tech empire. I pulled out of the parking space near the coffee shop and merged into the bustling Atlanta traffic. The crisp morning air flowing through the air conditioning vents felt remarkably refreshing. I had just left my mother-in-law and sister-in-law, standing in a state of absolute confusion, completely unaware that a process server was already knocking on their door. I felt a deep, resonant sense of peace. I was not operating on anger or spite. I was operating on pure, calculated logic. My personal life had been systematically dismantled by the man I married, but my professional life was an impenetrable fortress, or so I thought. As I swiped my security badge at the primary entrance of my downtown office building, my personal cell phone buzzed in the side pocket of my leather tote bag. I ignored it, stepping into the sleek, modern elevator and pressing the button for the 42nd floor. The elevator ride was silent, giving me a moment to mentally transition from a betrayed wife back to a senior forensic corporate auditor. When the polished steel doors slid open, I walked through the glass atrium of my firm. The environment here was always intense and hushed. We were not standard accountants filling out yearly tax returns. We were the elite tier of financial investigators. We contracted directly with federal oversight committees to trace stolen funds, dismantle fraudulent shell corporations, and hold white-collar criminals accountable. The air in the office hummed with the quiet intensity of people who handled highly classified financial data. I reached my private corner cubicle, hung my coat over the back of my ergonomic chair, and sat down. I woke up my encrypted workstation, preparing to dive into a complex healthcare audit I had been managing. That was when my personal phone buzzed again, followed by a rapid succession of 3 distinct chimes. Trevon was trying to reach me. I had spent the entire morning leaving frantic, sobbing voicemails about his frozen bank accounts and his empty closet. I assumed this was just another wave of his panic. I unlocked the screen, fully expecting a long, rambling text message begging me to drop the divorce proceedings and unfreeze his offshore funds. Instead, I found an image file. I tapped the screen to load the photograph. The high-resolution picture showed Trayvon and Vanessa sitting in what was unmistakably the private executive lounge of her tech company. The sweeping Atlanta skyline loomed massive and bright behind them through floor-to-ceiling windows. They were seated on a plush leather sofa, leaning close to one another in a display of arrogant solidarity. They were both holding crystal flutes filled with expensive champagne, clinking their glasses together directly toward the camera lens. Trevon was wearing a spare suit he must have kept at his office. His posture oozed a forced, desperate arrogance, his chest puffed out, as if he had just won a major victory. Vanessa sat beside him wearing a sharp designer blazer, her lips curled into a vicious, predatory smirk. She looked like a woman who believed she controlled the world, a woman who used her vast wealth as a weapon to crush anyone she deemed a nuisance. Beneath the image was a typed caption. "You should have just taken the quiet exit. Have fun in the unemployment line." I stared at the screen, my analytical mind instantly dissecting the nature of the threat. Trevon had realized he was financially paralyzed. His credit was ruined, his secret offshore accounts were locked behind a federal firewall, and he had likely just received a hysterical, screaming phone call from his mother Brenda about the 30-day eviction notice. Cornered, desperate, and entirely stripped of his own power, he had run straight to his wealthy mistress. He had convinced Vanessa to use her immense corporate influence to crush me. Vanessa was a titan in the tech industry. Her company moved hundreds of millions of dollars in venture capital every single quarter. She was a woman accustomed to destroying her enemies with a single strategically placed phone call. She believed her wealth made her untouchable. More importantly, her tech firm held a massive multi-million-dollar contract with my accounting agency for annual compliance auditing. I pieced it together in seconds. Vanessa had weaponized that contract. She had likely called the managing partner of my firm, directly demanding my head on a silver platter. She was trying to frame me for unprofessional conduct. She was probably spinning a fabricated narrative that I was a jealous, unstable, and vindictive wife who was trying to leverage confidential corporate data for a personal vendetta against her top sales director. She assumed my firm was just a standard tax agency, desperate to hold on to her lucrative account. She thought my managing partner would easily sacrifice a single employee to save a $20 million compliance contract. She thought I was disposable. I did not feel a spike of fear. I did not panic or rush to pack up my desk. I simply set my phone face down next to my keyboard and waited. I knew exactly what was about to happen next. 10 minutes later, the sharp, shrill tone of my desk phone cut through the quiet hum of my workspace. I glanced at the digital caller identification display. It was the internal extension for the executive suite. I picked up the receiver. The voice on the other end belonged to the managing partner's executive assistant. She did not use her usual cheerful greeting. Her tone was tight and completely professional. She asked me to come up to the corner office immediately. She added that I should bring a notepad and prepare for a serious discussion regarding an active client account. I thanked her, placed the receiver back on its cradle, and took a slow, deep breath. The managing partner of our firm was a 50-year-old African-American man who had built this forensic accounting empire from the ground up. He was sharp, unyielding, and completely immune to corporate bullying. He was a man who demanded absolute perfection and absolute integrity from every single auditor on his payroll. He did not tolerate internal drama, and he certainly did not tolerate client interference in his personnel decisions. I stood up, smoothed the front of my tailored skirt, and picked up my leather-bound notepad. I walked down the long carpeted hallway toward the executive suites. The walk felt charged with an electric tension. The other analysts and junior partners I passed gave me polite nods, completely unaware of the massive corporate collision that was about to take place behind closed doors. I knew exactly what Vanessa was trying to do. She wanted to strip me of my livelihood, to leave me financially destitute and humiliated, just like Trevin was right now. She wanted to prove that her wealth and status could override my marriage, my career, and my dignity. She wanted me standing in the unemployment line begging for a settlement. I reached the heavy mahogany doors of the corner office. The executive assistant gave me a tight, sympathetic look and pressed the button under her desk to unlock the door. The heavy click echoed in the quiet reception area. I pushed the door open and stepped inside the vast office. The walls were lined with leather-bound legal volumes and thick federal regulatory manuals. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the city, rivaling the view from Vanessa's executive lounge. The managing partner sat behind his massive desk, his hands steepled under his chin. He did not look angry. He looked incredibly serious, his dark eyes analyzing me with the intensity of a predator calculating its next strike. He gestured for me to sit in the heavy leather chair opposite him. I sat down, keeping my posture perfectly straight and my hands folded calmly in my lap. I did not interrupt the silence. I did not rush to defend myself or launch into an emotional explanation of my broken marriage. I knew that in this room raw emotion was considered a weakness. Only hard, verifiable facts mattered. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the polished wood of his desk. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He told me that he had just concluded a very unpleasant 30-minute phone call with the chief executive officer of one of our largest tech accounts. He stated that Vanessa had aggressively demanded my immediate termination. He recounted her threats with a clinical detachment, explaining that she had accused me of severe professional misconduct, corporate espionage, and harassment. He looked me directly in the eyes and said she had given the firm a strict ultimatum. She demanded that I be fired by noon, or she would pull her entire $20 million contract and drag our firm's reputation through the mud in the financial press. Trevin and Vanessa thought this was the end of my career. They thought the trap had successfully sprung. But as I sat in that leather chair, looking at the managing partner of an elite federal auditing firm, I knew Vanessa had just made the most catastrophic mistake of her entire life. I did not flinch. I sat perfectly still in the heavy leather chair as the weight of Elias' words settled into the quiet space between us. I looked out the massive floor-to-ceiling windows behind his desk. The Atlanta skyline stretched out for miles, bathed in the bright morning sunlight. Somewhere out there in a glass tower very similar to this one, Vanessa was sitting next to my husband, clinking champagne glasses and celebrating my impending destruction. She believed she had executed a flawless corporate strike. She believed $20 million was an astronomical sum that would force my managing partner to blindly and obediently follow her commands. She assumed that in the corporate world money always spoke louder than integrity. She assumed she held all the cards. I looked back at Elias. He was watching me closely. He was a man who had spent 3 decades dismantling corrupt empires and sending untouchable executives to federal prison. He had seen every variation of corporate greed and human desperation. He was waiting to see how I would react. He was waiting to see if I would crumble under the pressure, if I would cry, or if I would launch into a frantic emotional defense of my personal character. I knew that in this room raw emotion was considered a fatal liability. Only hard verifiable facts carried any weight. I took a slow, deep breath and finally broke the silence. I kept my voice incredibly even and devoid of any panic. I told Elias that the man I had been married to for the last 6 years had been engaging in a long-term affair with Vanessa. I watched Elias absorb the information. His expression remained entirely stoic. He did not offer pity or empty condolences because sympathy had no place in this office. I continued my report. I told him that I had uncovered the betrayal just a few weeks ago and had filed for a ruthless protective divorce earlier that very morning. Then I smoothly shifted the conversation away from the messy reality of my personal life and drove it directly into the cold, hard realm of federal jurisdiction. I told Elias that while preparing my divorce documentation and securing my personal assets, I had conducted a preliminary shadow audit on my husband. I explained that Trevon was a man who lived far beyond his means, but he was not a financial mastermind. I told Elias that I had noticed severe and highly sophisticated financial irregularities that did not match a standard tech sales director salary. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the polished mahogany edge of his desk. I detailed exactly how I had traced massive, unexplained wire transfers. I described the digital footprints that showed millions of dollars funneling directly from Vanessa's primary corporate operating accounts into offshore shell entities registered under Trevon's name in the Cayman Islands. I explained the use of phantom vendor payments and layered transactions designed specifically to evade standard banking reporting requirements. I made sure Elias understood the exact scale and intent of the crimes I had uncovered. I told him that Vanessa was not aggressively demanding my termination because she was a jealous mistress trying to mark her romantic territory. She was not firing me over a personal vendetta. I stated clearly that Vanessa was demanding my removal because she was absolutely terrified of what I might find if I ever looked at her company ledgers with the same forensic scrutiny I applied to my own household finances. She was trying to blind the very federal agency contracted to oversee her corporate compliance. The silence that followed my detailed summary was absolute and profound. The ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner of the executive office seemed to echo loudly against the wood-paneled walls. Elias did not blink. He slowly unsteepled his hands and placed them flat on the smooth surface of his desk. A cold, recognizing light sparked in his dark eyes. The tension in the room shifted from an interrogation into a mutual understanding between two apex predators who had just caught the scent of blood in the water. Elias leaned back in his heavy leather chair and let out a single humorless exhale. He looked at me and said that Vanessa had just made a fatal and truly catastrophic miscalculation. He explained that corporate executives like her often lived in isolated echo chambers built entirely out of their own wealth and power. They became so accustomed to bullying smaller vendors, intimidating tax preparation services, and throwing their money around to silence problems that they completely forgot who they were actually dealing with when they interacted with our specific firm. Elias continued, his voice dropping to a low, serious register. He explained the strict federal protocols and legal obligations our agency operated under. We were not standard accountants. We were a designated barrier against corporate fraud holding high-level security clearances. He told me that when a chief executive officer aggressively demands the immediate termination of a senior forensic investigator and does so using explicit financial extortion without providing a single shred of legally verifiable proof of misconduct, it trips an automatic hardwired alarm within our internal compliance system. He told me that Vanessa attempting to leverage a $20 million compliance contract to silence a federal auditor was not just a breach of professional ethics. It was a massive red flag and a textbook indicator of active financial concealment. Elias stated that by trying to force my firing through corporate blackmail, she had essentially painted a giant glowing target on her own back and handed the federal government the exact probable cause required to investigate her entire operation. Elias slowly reached down and opened the heavy bottom drawer of his desk. The smooth glide of the metal tracks was the only sound in the vast room. He reached inside and pulled out a thick classified dossier enclosed in a bright red cover. In our firm, a red dossier was rarely seen. It represented a critical immediate action federal mandate. It meant the gloves were coming off, and a corporate entity was about to be dismantled piece by piece. He placed the heavy red folder squarely in the center of the desk between us. He rested his large hand on top of it. He looked me directly in the eyes and said that he had absolutely no intention of firing me today or any other day. He stated with absolute conviction that any company willing to resort to open blackmail to remove one specific auditor was a company hiding something massive and illegal in their quarterly reports. Elias tapped the red cover of the dossier with his index finger. He informed me that instead of terminating my employment to appease a corrupt executive, he was officially promoting me. He slid the heavy file across the polished wood until it stopped right in front of my hands. He told me that as of this exact moment, I was being appointed as the lead investigator on a sudden full-scale, unannounced federal audit of Vanessa's entire tech empire. He outlined the parameters of my new assignment with ruthless clarity. I was given unrestricted authorization to assemble a dedicated task force from our senior analyst pool. I was granted full federal clearance to subpoena their internal communications, their shadow ledgers, and their international wire transfers. I was instructed to freeze their operational accounts the moment I found actionable proof of the embezzlement. I was going to tear Vanessa's carefully constructed corporate structure down to the foundation. I looked down at the red folder resting in front of me. The name of Vanessa's company was printed boldly across the top security label. A deep, resonant sense of absolute victory washed over me. Trevin and Vanessa thought they had orchestrated my complete downfall. They thought they had successfully backed me into a corner where my only option was to surrender, accept defeat, and walk away to the unemployment line with nothing. They had severely underestimated the woman they tried to discard. Instead of ruining my life, they had just handed me the keys to a federal bulldozer and given me explicit permission to drive it straight through their stolen fortune. I looked back up at Elias. I thanked him for his trust and his leadership. I assured him that the investigation would be executed with absolute ruthless precision and that every stolen dollar would be accounted for. I picked up the heavy red dossier, feeling its weight in my hands. I stood up from the leather chair, smoothed my skirt, and walked toward the heavy mahogany doors. The executive assistant buzzed me out, and I stepped back into the busy hallway of the firm. I was no longer just a betrayed wife navigating the wreckage of a broken marriage. I was a fully authorized federal investigator, and I was about to become the architect of their total and inescapable destruction. I walked back to my desk with the heavy red dossier pressed firmly against my side. The ambient noise of the office faded into a dull hum as my mind shifted into a state of absolute hyperfocus. The betrayed wife who had packed her husband's custom suits into industrial garbage bags was entirely gone. In her place stood a woman holding the full weight of federal oversight. I did not return to my standard cubicle. A red dossier classification granted me immediate access to the secure glass-walled conference rooms at the center of our floor. These rooms were completely soundproofed and strictly off-limits to anyone without top-tier clearance. I swiped my badge, pushed open the heavy glass door, and dropped the red folder onto the center of the massive oak table. I logged into the secure terminal built into the wall and immediately began assembling my task force. I selected 3 of the sharpest senior analysts in the firm. I needed individuals who could strip a corporate balance sheet down to its raw coding without asking unnecessary questions. Within 10 minutes, they were sitting around the table, their laptops open and their eyes locked on me. I did not give them any personal context. I simply informed them that we were initiating an immediate, unannounced dive into Vanessa's tech empire, focusing entirely on cash flow discrepancies within the regional sales divisions. The sheer scale of Vanessa's company was staggering. They handled billions of dollars in venture capital software licensing and government contracts. A standard auditor could spend 5 years looking at their ledgers and never find a single thing out of place. Vanessa had hired the most expensive corporate accountants in the country to ensure her surface-level documentation was absolutely flawless. Every expense report looked pristine. Every quarterly filing was perfectly formatted. But forensic auditing is not about looking at what is on the page. It is about hunting for what is missing. It is about feeling the empty spaces in the digital architecture where the money should be but is not. I directed my team to ignore the overarching corporate revenue and zoom directly in on the specific sales department Trevon directed. Trevon was arrogant, flashy, and prone to taking shortcuts. I knew how he operated in his personal life, and I knew that same sloppy entitlement would inevitably bleed into his professional conduct. I started pulling the raw, unfiltered transaction data from his division for the past 24 months. For the first 2 hours, the numbers presented a frustratingly perfect facade. Trayvon's department consistently showed record-breaking sales figures. The profit margins looked fantastic, which explained why he was constantly being praised at corporate retreats and groomed for the vice president position. But as I dug deeper, slicing through the layers of sanitized data, I noticed a very subtle, repetitive anomaly. There was a pattern of massive outgoing vendor payments being approved directly by Vanessa and routed exclusively through Trevon's specific sales division. These payments were labeled as independent software consulting fees and international marketing expenditures. On paper, they looked entirely legitimate. The invoices were flawlessly drafted, complete with tax identification numbers and professional letterheads. I pulled up the metadata attached to one of the largest vendor invoices. It was a payment for $2.5 million, supposedly sent to a tech consulting firm based in London. I instructed one of my analysts to cross-reference the supply chain logistics for that specific firm. 5 minutes later, my analyst looked up from her screen and confirmed exactly what I had suspected. The London consulting firm did not actually exist. It had no physical office, no registered employees, and no digital footprint beyond a basic landing page created just days before the $2.5 million invoice was generated. It was a phantom vendor. My pulse remained steady as I began to isolate every single invoice matching that exact profile. Trevon and Vanessa had not just done this once. Over the course of 18 months, they had generated dozens of these phantom invoices. They were using the massive legitimate revenue of the tech company to camouflage the fake outgoing payments. Vanessa would use her supreme executive authority to approve the expenditures without question, bypassing standard corporate oversight. Trevon would process the payments through his sales department, burying them deep within thousands of other legitimate daily transactions. They thought the sheer volume of money moving through the company would act as a smokescreen. They thought no one would ever have the authorization or the patience to dig deep enough to find the fake invoices. I initiated a secure federal trace on the outgoing routing numbers attached to the phantom vendors. The money did not go to London. It did not go to any legitimate business entity. The digital trail bounced through a series of automated routing algorithms deliberately designed to confuse financial tracking software before finally landing in a consolidated offshore account. I pulled up the encrypted file I had saved on my personal drive the night before. I opened the documentation I had gathered during my midnight shadow audit of Trevon's personal finances. I placed my personal findings side by side with the newly discovered corporate routing data on the large monitor in the conference room. The numbers matched perfectly. The offshore shell company, sitting at the end of the corporate embezzlement trail, was the exact same Cayman Island entity registered under Trevon's name. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the glowing screens. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal settled over me, but it brought absolutely no pain. It brought crystal-clear illumination. The late nights Trevon claimed he was working tirelessly to close major tech deals. The sudden unexplained influxes of cash he used to buy custom cars and designer suits. The arrogant smirks he gave me when he called my accounting career a waste of time. It all made perfect sense now. Trevon did not just sleep with Vanessa to secure a promotion. Vanessa did not just sleep with Trevon because she found him charming. Their affair was not born out of romance or passion. It was a calculated criminal partnership. They were actively siphoning millions of dollars of stolen investor funds, and they were using each other to facilitate the fraud. Vanessa needed a compliant, greedy subordinate who could process the fake invoices without asking questions. Trevon needed a wealthy executive who could approve the massive thefts while protecting him from corporate scrutiny. They were bound together by millions of dollars of stolen money. And Trevon, in his infinite arrogance, had likely convinced Vanessa that his boring, invisible wife would never be smart enough to catch them. He probably bragged to her that I was too busy balancing simple spreadsheets to ever understand the high-stakes world of tech finance. He used my quiet stability as his perfect cover. The process of unmasking a shell company requires patience. I watched the progress bars on my screen as our proprietary software chewed through millions of lines of financial code. I thought about the sheer audacity required to steal $12 million from seasoned tech investors. Vanessa was playing a highly dangerous game, leveraging the trust of her board of directors to fund a lavish secret lifestyle. Trevin was simply the eager accomplice blinded by the proximity to such vast, unchecked wealth. He genuinely believed that wearing expensive suits and drinking imported bourbon made him a titan of industry. In reality, he was nothing more than a glorified bagman for a corrupt executive. I instructed my team to immediately compile every single fraudulent invoice, wire transfer, and approval signature into a cohesive chronological prosecution file. We were no longer just auditing a company. We were building a bulletproof federal indictment. Every document I saved was another nail in their respective coffins. I meticulously linked Vanessa's digital authorization codes to the outgoing funds, ensuring she could not simply throw Trevin under the bus and claim ignorance. I linked Trevin's personal identification data to the receiving offshore accounts, ensuring he could not claim the money belonged to the corporation. They had stolen over $12 million in total. And right now, every single cent of that stolen money was completely paralyzed by the federal hold I had triggered hours ago. I watched the final pieces of the puzzle lock into place on my monitor. The federal trace confirmed that the Cayman Island accounts were completely frozen. The money was trapped. Trayvon and Vanessa could look at their digital balances all they wanted, but they could not move a single penny. They could not wire funds to a defense attorney. They could not buy a plane ticket out of the country. They were entirely financially immobilized. As the afternoon sun began to cast long shadows across the conference room table, I realized the exact position Trevon was currently in. He had woken up to an empty closet and frozen bank accounts. He had sent his mother and sister-in-law to intimidate me, only to inadvertently trigger their own eviction. He had run to Vanessa begging her to use her power to fire me, which only resulted in handing me the federal authority to audit her entire existence. I was out of moves. He was out of money. He was out of powerful allies. I knew exactly what a cornered narcissist would do next. He could no longer rely on his charm, his wealth, or his corporate backing. He would resort to raw, desperate aggression. He would try to regain control by breaking into the one space he thought he still commanded. I was going to come to my apartment. He was going to try to intimidate me physically. He was going to try to force me to undo the damage before he completely lost his mind. I calmly saved the master prosecution file to the secure federal server. I thanked my team for their exceptional work and dismissed them for the evening. I packed my briefcase with deliberate care, slipping my phone into my pocket. I left the glass conference room and walked toward the elevators. Let him come. I was absolutely ready for him. I left the federal building and drove straight to the heart of Midtown Atlanta. I had no intention of returning to the suburban house I had locked Trevin out of that morning. A cornered animal is dangerous, and I preferred to control the environment of our final private confrontation. Using a corporate concierge service, accessible to senior partners at my firm, I had secured a short-term lease on a luxury penthouse apartment earlier that day. It was sleek, minimalist, and equipped with a state-of-the-art security system that I had personally integrated with my own encrypted servers. I parked my vehicle in the reserved underground bay, took the private elevator up to the top floor, and unlocked the heavy steel door. The apartment was utterly silent, offering a panoramic view of the city as the evening sky turned the color of bruised plums. I placed my briefcase on the pristine kitchen island, poured myself a glass of sparkling water, and waited. I did not have to wait long. My phone illuminated with a silent alert. The external security cameras I had linked to the building access logs showed Trayvon pacing the sidewalk below. He looked completely unhinged. He had managed to tailgate a food delivery driver through the glass lobby doors, bypassing the front desk concierge entirely. I watched the live feed on my tablet as he aggressively pushed his way into the elevator and hit the button for the penthouse level. I stood perfectly still in the center of the living room. The heavy deadbolt on the front door clicked and rattled as someone tampered with the electronic keypad outside. Trevon had always prided himself on knowing people who could bypass basic security, a skill he bragged about during his failed startup days. A loud, violent crash echoed through the foyer as he threw his entire body weight against the door. The reinforced hinges groaned, but it was his second, desperate kick that finally splintered the electronic strike plate. The door swung open, slamming hard against the interior wall. Trevon stumbled into the apartment. He was a spectacular portrait of absolute ruin. He was still wearing the exact same suit trousers and dress shirt from the night before, but the fine Italian fabric was deeply wrinkled and stained with sweat. He was missing his silk tie. His eyes were bloodshot, darting wildly around the pristine, unfamiliar living room before finally locking onto me. The lingering stench of stale bourbon, sheer desperation, and cheap cologne radiated from him. He breathed heavily, his chest heaving as he stared at the woman he thought he had successfully discarded just 24 hours ago. He did not ask how I got the apartment. He did not ask how I knew the intricate details of his affair. He launched directly into a hysterical, screaming tirade about his mother. He marched toward me, his hands balled into tight fists at his sides. He shouted that a process server had shown up at the luxury townhouse in Buckhead, just as his mother was hosting her elite afternoon prayer circle. He screamed that Brenda had collapsed in the marble foyer when she read the 30-day eviction notice in front of her high society friends. He told me that my sister-in-law Sarah had gone into a complete furious spiral. According to Trevon, Sarah had shattered a crystal vase against the kitchen wall and screamed at his brother Malik because she realized she was about to be homeless. Trevon yelled that Sarah had already packed her designer bags and threatened to file for an immediate divorce. Sarah could not fathom why a shadow corporation owned the house they lived in, and she was absolutely furious that her free ride and her country club status were vanishing overnight. Brenda was currently sitting in a hotel room, inconsolable, humiliated, and stripped of the generational wealth illusion she had guarded so fiercely. Trevon pointed a shaking finger at my face, his voice cracking as he accused me of being a monster. He demanded to know what kind of evil, vindictive person buys a family home just to rip it away from an elderly woman. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I maintained absolute, unblinking eye contact. I told him that I bought the house to save his mother from her own financial incompetence, and I evicted her because I refused to subsidize the lifestyle of people who openly enabled my abuser. I kept my voice devoid of any emotion. My clinical detachment only fueled his rage. He paced frantically across the hardwood floor, running his hands over his head. He switched his focus from the townhouse to his own financial devastation. He demanded to know how I had frozen his offshore accounts. He yelled that his platinum credit cards were declining at every single payment terminal in the city. He said he had tried to buy an international plane ticket to flee the state, but the banking system had flagged his passport and denied the transaction. He accused me of hacking federal databases, screaming that what I had done was highly illegal and that I was going to rot in federal prison for tampering with his private wealth. He genuinely believed the money he had stolen from tech investors was his own private wealth. The depth of his delusion was staggering. He shouted that I had no right to touch his money, claiming that he had earned every single cent of it through his brilliant networking and innovative sales strategies. He completely ignored the fact that his supposed brilliance was entirely funded by fraudulent invoices and corporate embezzlement. He was a man drowning in a storm of his own making, blindly lashing out at the only person who refused to throw him a life preserver. Then, as if a switch flipped in his mind, he suddenly stopped pacing. He stood a few feet away from me and let out a harsh, breathless laugh. He tried to summon the arrogant, untouchable tech director persona he had worn the night before. He straightened his ruined posture, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and looked at me with a desperate, condescending sneer. He told me that I had played a cute game, but it was officially over now. He said he had just left Vanessa's private corporate estate. He bragged that Vanessa was not just some ordinary woman I could bully with standard accounting tricks. He called me a sad, boring, glorified calculator who had fundamentally misunderstood the food chain of the corporate world. He mocked my federal auditing job one last time, stating that a low-level number cruncher like me was absolutely no match for a billionaire titan of the tech industry. He took a step closer, lowering his voice into a vicious, calculated threat. He told me that Vanessa was absolutely furious about the inconvenience I had caused her. He claimed she had already mobilized her entire team of high-powered, ruthless corporate defense attorneys. He promised me that first thing Monday morning, those elite lawyers were going to descend on my firm and bury me in so much civil litigation that I would spend the rest of my miserable life paying off legal fees. He swore that Vanessa was going to sue me for corporate defamation, strip me of my forensic licenses, and ensure I was permanently blacklisted from the financial sector. He smirked, clearly believing his own fabricated lifeline. He told me that Vanessa's wealth was a tidal wave, and I was just a foolish woman standing on the beach with a bucket. He demanded that I log into my computer right then and there, release the holds on his offshore accounts, and withdraw the eviction notice for his mother. He told me that if I complied, he would personally convince Vanessa to show me mercy. He offered me a chance to walk away with a tiny sliver of my dignity before his powerful mistress completely annihilated my existence. I let his desperate, arrogant threat hang in the quiet air of my penthouse. The sheer audacity of his final offer was almost cinematic. He was standing in a ruined suit, sweating through his shirt, entirely locked out of his own life, yet he still believed he was the one holding the power. He believed that the phantom weight of Vanessa and her billions could shield him from the very real, very present danger standing right in front of him. I did not scream. I did not throw a glass at him, or demand to know how he could betray our marriage. I simply looked at him and smiled. It was a slow, deliberate smile that reached my eyes. It was the kind of smile that only comes from absolute, unshakable certainty. Trevon stopped breathing. The smug, condescending sneer on his face faltered, completely wiped away by the chilling realization that I was not reacting the way a terrified, defeated woman should. I reached into the pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out my cell phone. The screen was already glowing with a dedicated, encrypted application interface. I held the device up so he could see the bright red recording symbol flashing steadily in the top right corner. I pressed a single digital button on the screen, locking the audio file and securing the transmission. I kept my voice incredibly calm, pitching it in the clinical, detached tone of a federal investigator reading a suspect their rights. I told Trevon that the luxury apartment we were currently standing in was not just a random short-term rental. I explained that it was a secured corporate asset leased directly through my firm and equipped with a state-of-the-art security system. I informed him that the moment he forcefully kicked in the front door, the system had automatically initiated a secure, unbroken audio and video feed directly to the federal servers at my office. Trevon stared at my phone, the color rapidly draining from his face. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. I took a slow step forward, closing the distance between us, just enough to let him feel the absolute gravity of his situation. I told him that I had just allowed him to stand in my living room and scream a fully documented confession. I summarized exactly what the federal task force had just heard him say. He had explicitly admitted to possessing offshore accounts. He had admitted to participating in a corporate cover-up alongside his chief executive officer. He had actively attempted to extort a federal auditor by demanding, "I manipulate locked government databases under the direct threat of malicious civil litigation." I watched the muscles in his jaw slacken. His eyes darted toward the splintered front door, then back to my face as the catastrophic legal reality of his tantrum finally broke through his thick layer of narcissism. I did not stop there. I needed to dismantle the last remaining pillar of his delusion. I needed to tear down the false idol he had sacrificed our 6-year marriage to worship. I looked him dead in the eyes and stated coldly that Vanessa and her high-powered corporate lawyers could not help him. I told him that those elite, ruthless defense attorneys he was banking on to save his life were not going to file a single piece of civil litigation against me on Monday morning. In fact, those lawyers were likely resigning from Vanessa's legal team at this exact second. Trevon shook his head, his hands trembling at his sides. He stammered that I was lying. He said Vanessa was a titan, a billionaire, who could buy and sell my entire agency without blinking. He clung to her wealth like a lifeline, desperate to believe that she was still untouchable. I let out a soft, humorless laugh. I informed him that Vanessa was no longer a billionaire. I explained that 20 minutes ago while he was busy throwing a temper tantrum in my foyer. My elite task force had submitted our finalized bulletproof prosecution file to the Department of Justice. I told him that the federal government had just executed an emergency total asset seizure on Vanessa's entire corporate empire. I watched the absolute horror wash over his features as I laid out the meticulous destruction of his new life. I explained how the system works. When the federal government seizes corporate assets under suspicion of massive investor fraud and embezzlement, they do not leave a single penny behind. Vanessa's operating accounts were frozen. Her personal checking accounts were locked. Her stock portfolios were paralyzed. I told him that the elite lawyers she kept on retainer would immediately run a credit check, realize her incoming wire transfers were blocked by the federal government, and abandon her to save their own practices. I tilted my head, studying the complete psychological collapse of the man I used to love. I told him that right now, at this very moment, federal agents were likely walking through the glass doors of Vanessa's executive lounge. I painted the picture for him with ruthless detail. I told him that the woman he threw away our marriage for was currently being stripped of her electronics, locked out of her own boardroom, and read her rights in front of her entire staff. Trevin staggered backward as if he had been physically struck. His shoulders slumped, his chest caving inward as the adrenaline and bourbon completely left his system. The arrogant, untouchable tech sales director vanished entirely, leaving behind a pathetic, trembling shell of a man. His breathing became shallow and rapid. Sweat beaded on his forehead and rolled down his temples, staining the collar of his ruined dress shirt. He stumbled until the back of his knees hit the velvet sofa, and he collapsed onto the cushions. He buried his face in his shaking hands. The silence in the penthouse was deafening, broken only by the ragged, pathetic sound of his hyperventilation. He had gambled his stable, beautiful life on a shiny, fraudulent illusion, and he had lost absolutely everything. Suddenly, his head snapped up. His eyes were wide and brimming with tears. The aggression was completely gone, replaced by a sickening, desperate attempt at manipulation. He threw himself off the sofa and dropped to his knees on the hardwood floor right in front of me. He reached out his shaking fingers, hovering just inches from the hem of my tailored skirt, too terrified to actually touch me. He started sobbing. He begged me to listen to him. He cried that Vanessa had manipulated him, that she had used her power and her wealth to brainwash him into participating in the embezzlement. He swore that he never wanted to hurt me, that he had just gotten in too deep and did not know how to escape. He looked up at me with tears streaming down his face, playing the role of the helpless victim. He called me his wife. He used my name like a prayer, pleading with me to remember the vows we took. He begged me to delete the recording, to withdraw the audit, to use my federal clearance to save him from going to prison. He promised he would leave the tech industry, that he would go to counseling, that he would spend the rest of his life making it up to me. I looked down at him. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I did not feel a single twinge of the love I had harbored for him for 6 years. I felt nothing but absolute clinical disgust. I stepped back, putting distance between my designer shoes and his trembling hands. I told him in a voice as cold and hard as ice that he did not get to invoke our marriage vows. I reminded him that just 24 hours ago he had walked into our home reeking of another woman and proudly bragged about his infidelity. I reminded him that he had mocked my career, belittled my intellect, and allowed his mother and sister-in-law to publicly humiliate me for years. I told him that he was not a victim of corporate manipulation. He was a willing, eager participant in a massive fraud because his greed and his ego far outweighed his morality. I looked at the shattered door of my penthouse. I told him that my federal team already had all the evidence they needed to secure his conviction, and his recorded temper tantrum today was just the final nail in his coffin. I pointed toward the hallway. I ordered him to get off my floor. I told him to walk out of my apartment right now, or I would press the secondary button on my phone and have the building security team hold him until the local police arrived to arrest him for breaking and entering. Trevon stayed on his knees for a long, agonizing moment. He searched my face for any sign of hesitation, any lingering warmth he could exploit. He found a completely impenetrable fortress. Slowly, painfully, he dragged himself to his feet. He looked physically ill. His skin was gray, his eyes hollow and defeated. He did not say another word. He did not try to offer another hollow apology or hurl another baseless threat. He turned around and dragged his feet across the pristine hardwood floor, looking like a man walking to the gallows. He stumbled through the broken doorway, stepping over the splintered wood, and disappeared into the quiet, brightly lit hallway. I listened to the heavy, echoing thud of the elevator doors closing behind him. The threat was neutralized. The invader was gone. I was entirely alone in the quiet luxury of my penthouse. I walked over to the kitchen island, picked up my glass of sparkling water, and took a slow, refreshing sip. The city lights of Atlanta began to flicker on outside my massive windows, illuminating the skyline in a sea of gold and white. Tomorrow night, Vanessa's company was scheduled to host a highly publicized, lavish emergency shareholder gala at a downtown hotel. It was supposed to be the event where Trevin was crowned the new vice president. It was supposed to be their ultimate victory lap. I set my glass down on the marble counter. They were still going to have their gala. They were still going to gather the elite investors, the board of directors, and Trevin's toxic enabling family into one massive opulent ballroom. But I was going to be the one dictating the evening's entertainment. I pulled my laptop from my briefcase, opened the encrypted presentation file my team had finalized and prepared for the public execution. The next evening arrived with the heavy electric anticipation of a storm about to break. I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in my penthouse, adjusting the lapels of my tailored emerald green suit. I did not dress for a celebration. I dressed for a corporate execution. My hair was pulled back into a flawless, sharp style, and my expression was entirely void of mercy. I clipped my federal security badge to the inside pocket of my blazer, feeling the cool weight of the metal against my ribs. It was the only accessory I needed. Vanessa had chosen the Grand Monarch Hotel in downtown Atlanta for her emergency shareholder gala. It was a legendary venue, known for hosting the city elite, featuring massive crystal chandeliers, polished marble floors, and an atmosphere that dripped with generational wealth. She had booked their largest ballroom on less than 24 hours' notice, likely draining whatever petty cash reserves her company had left before the federal freeze fully locked down every single corporate credit line. She was a desperate woman attempting to project absolute invincibility. Rumors of the sudden asset freeze and the looming Securities and Exchange Commission investigation had inevitably begun, leaking through the highest levels of the financial sector. Investors were panicking. Board members were demanding answers. Vanessa hosted this lavish over-the-top event to stop the bleeding. She wanted to stand on a stage surrounded by champagne and caviar, smile into the cameras, and assure her wealthy backers that the company was more profitable than ever. She planned to use this exact night to publicly announce Trevon as the new vice president of global sales, framing his promotion as a strategic move to conquer new international markets. She was trying to build a fortress out of smoke and mirrors, completely unaware that I was already inside the building with a wrecking ball. I arrived at the hotel an hour before the gala was scheduled to begin. I did not walk through the main lobby where the photographers and eager investors were gathering. I entered through the secure service corridors alongside Elias and a dedicated task force of 12 federal agents dressed in sharp, unassuming evening wear. We quietly commandeered the security control room located directly above the main ballroom. My technical team immediately bypassed the hotel network, seizing total control of the massive audio-visual presentation screens flanking the main stage. I stood in the darkened control room, looking down through the tinted observation glass at the opulent ballroom below. The venue was a masterpiece of desperate excess. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos glided across the floor carrying silver trays loaded with crystal champagne flutes and expensive hors d'oeuvres. A live jazz quartet played softly in the corner, trying to mask the tense, nervous murmurs of the arriving shareholders. Then the doors opened and the guests of honor began to arrive. I watched the live security feed as my soon-to-be ex-husband walked into the ballroom. Trevin looked like a dead man walking. He was wearing a brand-new, sharply tailored tuxedo that he must have begged, borrowed, or stolen the funds to acquire, considering his personal accounts were entirely locked. but no amount of expensive fabric could hide the absolute terror radiating from his body. His skin had a sickly gray pallor. He was sweating profusely, constantly wiping his forehead with a monogrammed handkerchief. He kept darting his eyes toward the exits, twitching at every sudden sound. Trevin knew he was doomed. He knew the offshore accounts were seized. He knew my federal team possessed the recorded confession from my living room. But he was trapped in the gravitational pull of Vanessa's massive delusion. She had likely ordered him to attend, threatening him into compliance, convincing him that if they just played their parts perfectly tonight, her high-powered lawyers could magically fix the federal audit on Monday morning. How was a coward clinging to a sinking ship because he was too terrified to swim? A few moments later, his family made their grand entrance. I leaned closer to the observation glass, watching the toxic hierarchy of my former in-laws parade into the room. Brenda, Malik, and Sarah were escorted directly to the plush velvet seating in the exclusive VIP section right at the front of the stage. They were the very picture of unearned arrogance. Brenda was beaming with absolute radiant pride. She wore a stunning floor-length sequined gown and a heavy diamond necklace that sparkled under the ballroom lights. She looked around the room with an expression of supreme entitlement, nodding to the wealthy investors as if she belonged among them. She had spent my entire marriage treating me like a bitter, invisible disappointment, and tonight was supposed to be her ultimate vindication. She was here to watch her golden child ascend to the throne of a tech empire. She had clearly chosen to completely ignore the certified eviction notice, currently sitting on her kitchen counter. In her mind, Trevin's impending multi-million-dollar promotion as vice president would magically wipe away the fact that she was living in a townhouse owned by my shadow corporation. She truly believed her son was going to hand her the world. Sitting right beside her was Sarah, the white sister-in-law, who had spent years weaponizing her privilege to make me feel small. Sarah looked incredibly smug, sipping champagne and leaning over to whisper conspiratorially into Malik's ear. She was wearing a designer silk dress and clutching a luxury evening bag that likely cost more than a standard mortgage payment. Every single piece of luxury draped over her body had been funded by the stolen investor money Trevon had siphoned from Vanessa's company. Sarah smiled at the passing waiters, completely oblivious to the impending doom hovering directly above her head. She thought she was untouchable. She thought she had married into a dynasty of untouchable wealth. She had mocked my career just yesterday morning in the coffee shop, bragging about how they were hiding the family assets from me. She had no idea that the very assets she was so proud of were currently frozen in a federal evidence locker. She had no idea that her lavish lifestyle was about to violently implode in front of hundreds of people. Malik sat next to his wife, looking completely complacent and aggressively average. He was perfectly content to ride his younger brother's coattails into high society, ignoring the obvious red flags surrounding Trevin's sudden wealth. The entire family operated on a foundation of deliberate, comfortable ignorance. They did not care who was hurt, betrayed, or destroyed, as long as the champagne kept flowing and the designer labels kept coming. I watched them toast each other in the VIP section, raising their crystal glasses in a celebration of their own greed. They were laughing. They were genuinely, completely happy. I felt no anger. I felt no sorrow. I felt the cold, sharp precision of a surgeon holding a scalpel over a diseased organ. Elias stepped up beside me in the control room. He folded his arms across his chest and looked down at the ballroom floor. He quietly confirmed that the federal agents were stationed at all 4 main exits. He stated that the local police department had marked the perimeter, and the arrest warrants were signed, sealed, and currently sitting in the pockets of the lead marshals, waiting in the service hallway. We turned our attention back to the main stage. As the lighting in the ballroom began to dim, the jazz quartet brought their music to a smooth, elegant halt. The dull roar of shareholder conversation faded into a tense, expectant silence. Vanessa stepped out from behind the heavy velvet curtains and walked to the center of the stage. She looked absolutely formidable. She wore a sharp custom white pantsuit that projected pure, unadulterated power. Her posture was flawless. Her makeup was immaculate. She stepped up to the crystal podium and adjusted the microphone, offering the crowd a brilliant practiced smile that completely masked the desperate, bleeding financial reality of her corporation. Trevin stepped out of the shadows and took his designated place a few feet behind her left shoulder. He looked like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming freight train. He tried to mimic Vanessa's confident smile, but his facial muscles twitched nervously, and he kept shifting his weight from foot to foot. Down in the VIP section, Brenda sat forward on the edge of her velvet seat. She clapped enthusiastically, her eyes shining with tears of pride as she gazed up at her son. Sarah raised her phone, recording the moment for her social media, eager to show the world how important her family was. Vanessa cleared her throat, her voice echoing smoothly through the high-definition sound system. She welcomed the investors, the board members, and the distinguished guests. She spoke eloquently about the incredible vision of the company, the record-breaking profits they had supposedly generated this quarter, and the unstoppable momentum of their global expansion. She was lying effortlessly, weaving a beautiful, expensive tapestry of corporate fraud right in front of the people she was actively robbing. She paused for dramatic effect, letting her gaze sweep over the silent, captivated audience. She raised her hand and gestured toward Trayvon. She announced that to guide their company into this prosperous new era, they needed a man of unparalleled integrity, vision, and dedication. She prepared to officially name Trayvon as the new vice president of global sales. I did not wait for her to finish her sentence. I turned to the lead technician sitting at the control console. I gave him a single definitive nod. The technician pressed a button, instantly cutting the power to Vanessa's microphone. The sudden dead silence in the ballroom was deafening. Vanessa tapped the microphone, her perfect smile faltering as she looked toward the sound booth in confusion. I turned away from the observation glass. I smoothed the lapels of my emerald green suit one last time. I opened the door of the control room, walked down the service stairs, and headed straight for the main ballroom doors. It was time to introduce the family to the harsh, unforgiving reality of a federal audit. I pushed open the heavy service doors on the ground floor. The transition from the stark concrete stairwell to the opulent ballroom was jarring. The air inside the grand hall was thick with confusion. Vanessa was still standing at the crystal podium, tapping the dead microphone, her perfect smile slipping into a tight line of irritation. Trayvon stood behind her, shifting his weight, looking completely lost. The jazz musicians in the corner held their instruments awkwardly, unsure if they should resume playing. Two federal agents in dark suits stepped up beside me. We walked in perfect synchronization down the center aisle of the ballroom. The crowd of wealthy investors and board members naturally parted for us, sensing the heavy, undeniable authority radiating from our formation. The soft clicking of my heels on the polished marble floor echoed in the silent room. As I approached the front of the stage, I passed directly by the velvet ropes of the VIP section. Sarah spotted me first. Her eyes narrowed in utter disbelief. She leaned forward in her chair, clutching her designer evening bag, her face twisting into a scowl. She whispered something to Malik, pointing a manicured finger in my direction. Brenda stood up abruptly. She smoothed the front of her sequined gown, her chest puffing out with indignation. She opened her mouth, fully prepared to cause a scene, fully prepared to yell at me for ruining her golden child's moment of glory. I did not even look at her. I walked right past her extended hand, entirely ignoring her existence. I approached the secondary floor microphone positioned near the steps of the main stage. One of the federal agents stepped forward and handed me the wireless device. I turned it on. The sharp, clear feedback of the live microphone cut through the tension in the room. I stood at the base of the stage, looking up at Vanessa and Trayvon. I turned my body to face the hundreds of elite shareholders sitting in the audience. I introduced myself. I gave them my full name. I did not introduce myself as the wife of the man standing on the stage. I introduced myself as a senior forensic corporate auditor operating under the direct authority of the federal government. A collective murmur rippled through the crowd. Board members shifted in their seats. Wealthy venture capitalists exchanged nervous glances. Up on the stage, the color completely drained from Vanessa's face. The predatory confidence she had worn all evening shattered into a million pieces. She gripped the edges of the crystal podium so hard her knuckles turned white. Trayvon took a stumbling step backward, his eyes wide with absolute horror. He knew exactly what was about to happen. I looked up at the darkened control booth window where Elias was watching. I gave him a subtle nod. Immediately, the massive high-definition presentation screens flanking the main stage flickered to life. They did not display the colorful, fabricated corporate growth charts Vanessa had prepared. They displayed raw, unredacted federal banking documents. The sudden bright light of the screens illuminated the shocked faces of the audience. I spoke into the microphone, my voice steady, clinical, and completely devoid of emotion. I addressed the shareholders directly. I told them that the woman standing at the podium had just lied to them. I stated that the record-breaking profits and global expansion plans she had just promised were nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion designed to hide a massive corporate hemorrhage. I pointed to the screen on my left. I explained that for the past 18 months, their chief executive officer had been using her supreme executive authority to bypass standard financial oversight. I directed their attention to a specific column of numbers. I broke down the concept of phantom vendors. I explained how Vanessa had fabricated dozens of fake international consulting firms, generating flawless invoices for services that never existed. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, turning into sharp gasps of outrage as the realization began to set in. I turned my attention to Trevon. He was visibly shaking his tailored tuxedo, doing nothing to hide the pathetic, trembling reality of his guilt. I pointed to the screen on my right. I told the investors that a scheme of this magnitude required a compliant accomplice on the inside. It required someone who could bury the fraudulent vendor payments deep within legitimate daily sales transactions. I announced that the man they were about to applaud, the man Vanessa was about to promote to vice president of global sales, was the architect of that cover-up. I stated clearly that Trevon had processed every single fake invoice. I explained that their professional relationship was a smokescreen for a long-term romantic affair, a partnership built entirely on greed and stolen funds. Brenda let out a loud, dramatic gasp from the VIP section. She dropped her crystal champagne flute. It shattered against the marble floor, but nobody paid any attention to her. Everyone was staring at the screens. Sarah sat frozen in her seat, her smug smirk completely erased, replaced by a mask of sheer panic. I pressed a button on the wireless remote in my hand, transitioning the slides on the massive screens. The presentation shifted to display the final destination of the stolen investor funds. I showed the audience the digital tracing algorithms my team had spent the day perfecting. I walked them through the complex routing networks, showing how their investments bounced through international servers before landing in a consolidated offshore shell account in the Cayman Islands. I read the exact routing numbers aloud. I read the name of the shell corporation. And then I displayed the ownership registration of that offshore account. The name on the screen was undeniable. It belonged entirely to Trevon. I looked out at the audience and delivered the final, devastating financial blow. I told them that the total amount of venture capital stolen from their portfolios was exactly $12,400,000. Total pandemonium erupted in the ballroom. Shareholders jumped to their feet, shouting in anger. Board members grabbed their cell phones, frantically trying to dial their wealth managers. The atmosphere shifted from an elegant corporate gala into a scene of absolute uncontrolled chaos. I raised my hand and the federal agents flanking me stepped forward, their presence radiating a silent demand for order. The crowd quieted just enough for my voice to carry over the sound system once more. I assured the investors that they did not need to panic about their missing capital. I informed them that as of earlier this afternoon, my forensic task force had submitted our finalized prosecution file to the Department of Justice. I stated that the federal government had successfully executed an emergency asset seizure on both Vanessa and Trevon. I told them that every single cent of the $12 million had been located, frozen, and secured in a federal holding account pending restitution. The relief that washed over the crowd was palpable, but it was immediately replaced by a unified burning fury directed at the stage. Vanessa stood frozen at the podium. She looked like a statue, completely paralyzed by the public exposure of her crimes. She had built her entire identity on being untouchable, on using her wealth to intimidate and control everyone around her. Now she was standing under the bright glare of the presentation screen, stripped of her power, her secrets laid bare for the entire financial sector to see. Trevon looked down at me from the stage. His eyes were red and brimming with tears. He silently pleaded with me, silently begging for a mercy he never once extended to me during our 6-year marriage. He wanted me to stop. He wanted me to turn off the microphone and save him from the consequences of his own monumental arrogance. I did not offer him a single ounce of pity. I looked at the man who had stumbled into our home at midnight reeking of bourbon and boasting about his infidelity. I looked at the man who had drained my finances, mocked my career, and enabled his family to treat me like dirt. I lowered the microphone. My part in this public execution was officially complete. The financial truth had been surgically extracted and presented to the light. The trap had been sprung, and there was absolutely no escape for either of them. I turned my back on the stage and looked toward the VIP section one last time. Brenda was clutching her chest, struggling to breathe, as the reality of her golden child's complete destruction settled over her. Sarah was frantically typing on her phone, likely trying to figure out how to salvage her own comfortable lifestyle, now that the illusion of the family wealth was thoroughly shattered. I gave them a small, polite nod, the exact same nod I gave them in the coffee shop when they thought they had won. Then I stepped aside, clearing the path for the federal marshals waiting in the wings. The federal marshals moved with the terrifying silent efficiency of a localized natural disaster. They stepped through the velvet ropes, their dark suits cutting a sharp contrast against the glittering gowns and tailored tuxedos of the panicked shareholders. As they ascended the steps of the main stage, the sheer, undeniable reality of federal intervention finally shattered the paralysis gripping the room. Vanessa snapped first. The brilliant, untouchable tech titan realized in a fraction of a second that her empire was dead, her fortune was seized, and she was staring down the barrel of a multi-decade federal prison sentence. Her survival instincts, honed by years of ruthless corporate warfare, kicked in with vicious speed. She did not accept her defeat with dignity. She lunged forward and grabbed the primary microphone from the crystal podium, her knuckles white, her face twisted into a mask of desperate performative outrage. She pointed a shaking finger directly at Trevon. Her voice echoed through the high-definition speakers, sharp and piercing, cutting over the roar of the crowd. She screamed that she had been entirely deceived. She shouted to the investors and the advancing federal agents that she had absolutely no knowledge of the offshore accounts or the phantom vendors. She threw Trevon under the bus with a velocity that was breathtaking to witness. She claimed that Trevon was a rogue, manipulative subordinate who had orchestrated the entire embezzlement scheme behind her back. She yelled that he had weaponized his position as the sales director to isolate the regional accounts, deliberately blinding the executive board to his massive financial crimes. She painted herself as the ultimate victim, a trusting chief executive officer who had been expertly conned by a sociopathic con artist. She explicitly stated that Trevon had forged her digital authorization signatures, leveraging their professional proximity to bypass the standard corporate firewalls. Trevon stared at her, his eyes wide with a level of shock and devastation that transcended his financial ruin. The woman he had destroyed our 6-year marriage for the billionaire mistress he believed was his ultimate partner and protector was currently offering him up on a silver platter to the Department of Justice to save her own skin. The betrayal broke whatever fragile tether Trevon had left to his sanity. The illusion of his power, his charm, and his new high society life evaporated in an instant. He lunged toward Vanessa, his face contorted in absolute rage. He did not care about the cameras. He did not care about the investors watching them. He screamed back at her, his voice raw and echoing across the grand stage without the need for a microphone. He called her a liar and a coward. He shouted that she had orchestrated every single detail of the fraud to fund her lavish lifestyle and inflate her corporate projections. He viciously exposed her backdoor dealings, screaming specific dates and times when she had personally ordered him to route the stolen venture capital into the Cayman Island shell accounts. He yelled that he was just following her direct orders, that she had groomed him, seduced him, and used his sales division as a convenient dumping ground for her own massive financial crimes. They stood on the brightly lit stage, two former lovers tearing each other apart in front of the very people they had robbed. It was an ugly, visceral display of pure, unadulterated greed collapsing in on itself. There was no loyalty among thieves. The moment the federal spotlight hit them, they morphed into rabid animals fighting over the scraps of their ruined lives. The federal marshals reached the center of the stage, physically stepping between the screaming executives. The lead marshal did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply grabbed Trevin's wrist, twisting his arm behind his back, with practiced mechanical force. The sharp, heavy metallic clink of steel handcuffs snapping shut echoed through the ballroom. Another marshal flanked Vanessa, ignoring her frantic demands to call her corporate defense attorneys. He firmly secured her wrists behind the back of her pristine white designer pantsuit. The lead marshal pulled a laminated card from his breast pocket. He read them their Miranda rights. His deep, authoritative voice carried across the silent, stunned audience. He informed them that they had the right to remain silent, a right neither of them had the intelligence to exercise just moments prior. Trevin stopped screaming. As the cold steel locked around his wrists and the reality of his arrest washed over him, his legs gave out. A federal marshal had to grip him by the collar of his ruined tuxedo to keep him from collapsing completely onto the stage floor. Trevon began to sob. It was not a quiet, dignified crying. It was the loud, ugly, hyperventilating wail of a man who realized his entire existence was over. I turned my gaze away from the stage and looked down at the VIP section. Brenda was watching the destruction of her golden child in absolute, unmitigated horror. She had spent her entire life shielding Trevon from consequences, making excuses for his failures, and blaming other people for his mistakes. She had proudly worn the cashmere coat funded by his stolen money, fully believing he was ascending to the absolute pinnacle of corporate royalty. Now she was watching federal agents haul her sobbing son off a stage in handcuffs. Brenda let out a guttural, piercing wail. It was a sound of pure agony and denial. She pushed past the velvet ropes, stumbling toward the front of the stage. She reached her hands out, screaming for the federal agents to stop crying out that there had been a terrible mistake, that her son was a good man, that he was innocent. She fell to her knees on the polished marble floor, her heavy diamond necklace catching the stage lights as she sobbed uncontrollably. The wealthy elite standing around her did not rush to her side. The high society investors, the board members, and the venture capitalists physically stepped back, pulling away from Brenda as if her public humiliation was a contagious disease. She was entirely alone in her grief, abandoned by the very social circle she had sacrificed her morality to impress. She had nothing left. Her generational wealth was a lie. Her house was actively facing eviction, and her golden child was officially a federal criminal, sitting a few feet away in the designated VIP seating. Sarah had watched the entire catastrophe unfold with a completely different reaction. Sarah was not crying. She was not screaming for Trevon or rushing to comfort her devastated mother-in-law. Sarah had stopped recording the event on her phone the exact moment the federal agents walked into the room. I watched her perfectly manicured fingers grip the edges of her luxury evening bag. I watched the cold, rapid calculation happening behind her eyes. Sarah had married into this family, specifically for the money, the status and the comfort of a sprawling luxury townhouse in Buckhead. She had spent the last 2 years treating me with aggressive contempt because she believed I was a temporary peasant and she was permanent royalty. But Sarah was not loyal to Malik. She was not loyal to Brenda. She was loyal only to her own comfort. She looked up at the massive presentation screens still displaying the frozen offshore accounts. She looked at Trevon being dragged out the side door by the marshals. She looked at Brenda wailing on the floor. She did the math. She realized that the family money was entirely gone. She realized the 30-day eviction notice she had scoffed at was an absolute inescapable reality. They were facing imminent homelessness, federal investigations, and complete social bankruptcy. Sarah stood up from her plush velvet chair. She smoothed the front of her expensive silk dress. She did not look at Brenda sobbing on the marble floor. She turned and looked directly at her husband Malik. Malik was standing frozen, his mouth hanging open in shock, completely incapable of processing the destruction of his family. He reached a hand out toward his wife, desperately seeking a familiar anchor in the chaos. Sarah looked at his extended hand with an expression of profound, chilling disgust. She saw a man who had no job, no money, and no future. She saw a man who had entirely depended on his younger brother's stolen wealth to survive. She literally shook her head, adjusting the strap of her designer bag on her shoulder. She turned her back on him. She did not say a single word. She did not offer an apology or a tearful goodbye. She simply began walking toward the main exit of the ballroom. Her expensive heels clicked rhythmically against the floor, moving with deliberate, unhurried purpose. Malik snapped out of his paralysis. He took a step forward, calling her name. He begged her to wait, asking where she was going, pleading with her not to leave him there. Sarah did not look back. She did not break her stride. She walked right out of the grand ballroom, abandoning her husband, her mother-in-law, and her entire marriage on the spot. She was walking away from the sinking ship, eager to distance herself from the wreckage and find a new source of wealth to latch onto. I stood near the base of the stage, watching the total systemic collapse of the toxic hierarchy that had tormented me for 6 years. The arrogant tech director was in federal custody. The corrupt executive had lost her empire. The enabling mother was weeping on the floor of a hotel she could no longer afford. The smug, entitled sister-in-law had fractured the family unit in her haste to save herself. There was no physical violence. There was no screaming match or emotional pleading on my end. I had simply applied the pressure of absolute truth to a foundation built entirely on lies, and I watched the entire structure crush them under its own weight. I turned away from the chaos. I adjusted the lapels of my emerald green suit, walked through the parted crowd of stunned investors, and exited the ballroom through the main doors. My work here was done. The audit was complete and the balance had been perfectly ruthlessly restored. The cool night air of Atlanta hit my face the moment I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the Grand Monarch Hotel. Behind me, the ballroom was still a hive of panic and federal action, but out here on the street, the world was completely still. I took a deep breath of the crisp air. I did not look back at the flashing lights of the police cruisers pulling up to the service entrance. I walked to my waiting vehicle, tipped the valet, and drove away from the wreckage of my former life. The next 72 hours moved with the blinding speed of a perfectly executed federal strike. The financial press picked up the story before midnight. By sunrise, the faces of Vanessa and Trevon were plastered across every major news network and financial blog in the country. The headlines were ruthless. They did not paint Vanessa as a tragic victim of a rogue employee, and they certainly did not paint Trayvon as a brilliant tech visionary. They were exposed as exactly what they were. They were common thieves who thought they could outsmart the federal government. The initial arraignment hearing was a spectacle of absolute defeat. I did not attend in person, but Elias received the direct transcripts from the federal prosecutor assigned to the case. Vanessa saw her elite corporate defense attorneys, the ones Trevin bragged would bury me in civil litigation, do exactly what I predicted. They ran a comprehensive check on her frozen assets, realized they were not going to get paid, and immediately dropped her as a client. She was forced to stand in front of a federal judge represented by a panicked junior public defender who had zero experience with massive corporate embezzlement cases. Trevin looked even worse. The arrogance that had fueled him for 6 years was entirely gone, replaced by the hollow, trembling reality of a man facing the absolute end of his existence. The federal prosecutor presented the staggering volume of forensic evidence my team had compiled. They showed the judge the fake vendor invoices, the encrypted offshore routing numbers, and the recorded audio confession Trevon had willingly screamed in my living room. The judge took one look at the sheer scale of the fraud and the undeniable flight risk posed by the international accounts. He slammed his gavel down and denied bail for both of them without a second thought. They were remanded to federal custody immediately. They were looking at a minimum of 20 years in federal prison with no possibility of early parole. While Trevon traded his custom Italian suits for a standard-issue county jumpsuit, his family was experiencing their own rapid descent into reality. The 30-day eviction notice I had delivered to the Buckhead townhouse was not an empty threat. It was an absolute legally binding guarantee. Brenda had spent the first week in a state of aggressive denial. She tried to call my phone dozens of times, leaving voicemails that wildly fluctuated between furious demands and pitiful sobbing pleas. She demanded that I show some respect for my elders. She cried that I was tearing a family apart over a simple misunderstanding. She even tried to invoke the memory of the vows I took with her son, completely ignoring the fact that her son had treated those vows like garbage while she actively cheered him on. I blocked her number. I blocked Malik. I instructed my property management firm to handle all further communications, and I put the luxury townhouse on the market. In a highly sought-after neighborhood like Buckhead, a prime piece of real estate does not sit empty for long. Within 14 days, my shadow corporation accepted a cash offer from an out-of-state buyer that was significantly over the asking price. The new owners wanted immediate possession. The property manager arrived on the 30th day, accompanied by two local sheriff's deputies to ensure the premises were vacated smoothly. Brenda and Malik were forced to carry their belongings out the front door in cardboard boxes. There were no professional moving trucks paid for by Trevon. There was no financial safety net. They had to watch as the locks were changed on the massive front doors, locking them out of the generational wealth illusion they had guarded so fiercely. The neighbors they had spent years trying to impress stood on their manicured lawns and watched the entire humiliating process unfold. With Trevon's stolen money seized and Malik possessing absolutely no savings of his own, they had nowhere to go but down. They were forced to sign a lease on a tiny rundown two-bedroom apartment in a heavily industrialized neighborhood on the far outskirts of the city. Brenda went from hosting lavish high-society prayer circles on a rooftop terrace to sitting in a cramped living room, listening to the roar of highway traffic right outside her thin single-pane windows. Her country club memberships were revoked due to unpaid dues, and her church friends conveniently stopped returning her calls. The true collapse of their family dynamic, however, was orchestrated by Sarah. Sarah had married into the family entirely for the status and the financial comfort. The moment she realized the money was an illusion, she severed ties with breathtaking cruelty. She did not even wait for the eviction notice to expire. The morning after the disastrous shareholder gala, Sarah hired a cutthroat divorce attorney, using a secret credit card she had hidden from Malik. She filed for an immediate at-fault divorce, citing severe financial deception and emotional distress. She did not handle the separation quietly. Sarah wanted to make sure her wealthy friends knew she was a victim, not an accomplice. She leaked the details of Malik's financial incompetence to everyone in their social circle. She publicly humiliated him, claiming he was a lazy, dependent man who had lied to her about his family wealth. She packed up every single piece of designer clothing, jewelry, and luxury accessory she had accumulated over the past 3 years and moved into her affluent parents' guest house in the suburbs. She left Malik standing in the empty master bedroom of the Buckhead townhouse with nothing but his clothes and the crushing realization that his marriage had been entirely transactional. The toxic hierarchy that had tormented me for 6 years completely imploded under the weight of its own greed. They had built their entire identities on the foundation of Trevon's fraudulent success. Brenda had enabled her son's narcissism because it funded her lavish lifestyle. Malik had stayed quiet and compliant because it afforded him a rent-free luxury home. Sarah had weaponized her privilege to mock my hard work because she mistakenly believed her married status made her superior. The moment the stolen money was removed from the equation, their loyalty to one another vanished. They did not band together in their time of crisis. They turned on each other like starving wolves. Brenda blamed Malik for not being as successful as Trevon. Malik blamed Brenda for losing the townhouse by trusting his brother. Sarah blamed all of them for ruining her social standing. They were a family bound together solely by entitlement. And the moment that entitlement was challenged, they shattered completely. I watched the fallout from a comfortable distance, viewing the wreckage through public court filings and brief updates from my property manager. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I had not forced Trevon to steal millions of dollars. I had not forced Vanessa to cover it up. I had not forced Brenda to treat me with aggressive contempt or Sarah to hurl racist insults in a coffee shop. They had made those choices freely and eagerly. I simply handed them the mirror and forced them to look at the consequences. The federal task force completed the asset recovery phase within a month. Every single dollar of the $12 million that had been routed to the Cayman Islands was successfully repatriated to the defrauded investors. My role in the investigation concluded with a flawless final report that Elias personally submitted to the Securities and Exchange Commission. The professional validation was immense, but the personal victory was even sweeter. I had taken the worst moment of my life, and I had forged it into an unbreakable armor. I was no longer the quiet, accommodating wife shrinking myself to fit into a mold designed by a narcissist. I was a fully realized independent woman who commanded absolute respect. The storm had finally passed and the wreckage of their lives was entirely behind me. 2 weeks after the spectacular collapse of Vanessa's corporate empire, I received a formal visitation request from the Federal Detention Center in downtown Atlanta. Trevon had used his one allotted phone call to contact my legal team, begging them to arrange a brief face-to-face meeting with me. He claimed he had vital information regarding the hidden offshore accounts that he would only share directly with his wife. I knew this was a desperate lie. My forensic task force had already successfully repatriated every single stolen dollar to the defrauded investors. Trevon had absolutely no leverage left to offer. He simply wanted an audience. I decided to grant his request not out of pity or lingering affection, but because I required absolute undeniable closure. I wanted to look him in the eyes one last time and sever the final invisible thread tying my life to his catastrophic mistakes. I arrived at the federal holding facility on a Tuesday morning. The building was a bleak, imposing fortress of gray concrete, reinforced steel, and razor wire. A sharp and permanent contrast to the luxury high-rise hotels Trevon used to frequent. I walked through the metal detectors and security checkpoints wearing a flawless tailored cream suit. My heels clicked rhythmically against the scuffed linoleum floors of the sterile visitation wing. A corrections officer escorted me to a small, isolated booth divided by a thick pane of bulletproof glass. I sat down on the hard metal stool, placed my leather briefcase on the narrow counter, and waited. A few minutes later, a heavy steel door on the opposite side of the glass swung open. 2 armed guards escorted Trevon into the visitation booth. The sight of him was jarring. The arrogant, smooth-talking tech sales director who used to mock my career was entirely gone. He was wearing a baggy, bright orange standard-issue county jumpsuit. His wrists were secured in heavy metal cuffs that were chained to his waist. His posture was completely broken. He shuffled toward the glass, his shoulders slumped and his head hanging low. He had aged 10 years in 14 days. His skin was pale and drawn, stripped of the expensive skincare routines and the artificial confidence of his stolen wealth. Dark, heavy bags hung under his bloodshot eyes. He looked exactly like what he was, a cornered, defeated criminal who had run out of people to manipulate. He sat down heavily on the stool opposite me. He picked up the heavy black telephone receiver with trembling hands. I picked up my receiver and held it to my ear. I did not say a word. I simply looked at him, my expression entirely clinical and detached. The moment Trevon heard the connection click, he broke down. He did not offer a dignified apology or a rational explanation for his crimes. He immediately launched into a frantic, sobbing, pathetic plea for mercy. Tears streamed down his hollow cheeks as he pressed his forehead against the bulletproof glass. He begged me to forgive him. He cried that he had been completely brainwashed by Vanessa. He claimed that she had preyed on his insecurities, that she had used her massive wealth and corporate power to force him into compliance. He tried to rewrite history, painting himself as an innocent victim who was simply trying to secure a better financial future for our family. He looked at me through the smudged glass, his voice cracking as he called me his true love. He swore that he had never stopped loving me, that the affair meant absolutely nothing, and that he was blinded by the pressure of the tech industry. He pleaded with me to speak to the federal prosecutor. He begged me to use my high-level clearance and my elite position at the auditing firm to negotiate a plea deal on his behalf. He promised that if I just saved him from spending the next 20 years in a federal prison cell, he would dedicate the rest of his life to making me happy. I let him cry. I sat perfectly still, holding the plastic receiver to my ear, listening to the pathetic, desperate rambling of a man who had entirely destroyed his own life. I did not feel a single flicker of anger. I did not feel a drop of sadness. I looked at the man I had shared a home with for 6 years, and I realized with absolute clarity that I was looking at a stranger. The charming, ambitious husband I thought I knew had never actually existed. I was nothing more than a parasite who had fed on my stability until he found a richer host to exploit. When he finally ran out of breath, his sobbing reducing to ragged, desperate gasps, I opened my leather briefcase. I pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bound by a heavy blue clip. Trevon stared at the papers, his tear-filled eyes widening in confusion. I kept my voice incredibly calm, pitching it in a smooth, quiet register that carried absolute finality over the phone line. I told him that I was not here to negotiate with the federal prosecutor. I told him that his trial was entirely out of my hands, and that he was going to face the full, unmitigated consequences of his monumental greed. I informed him that because he was currently facing decades of federal incarceration, and because every single one of his personal and corporate assets had been completely seized and liquidated by the government, my legal team had successfully expedited our separation proceedings. He had absolutely no remaining wealth to contest, no property to claim, and no legal standing to demand a prolonged mediation. I slid the heavy packet of finalized ruthless divorce papers through the narrow metal slot at the bottom of the bulletproof glass. The documents landed on the counter right in front of his chained hands. I told him that he was no longer my husband. I told him that he was officially, legally, and permanently erased from my existence. Trevin stared down at the divorce decree. Fresh tears spilled over his eyelashes, dropping onto the pristine white paper. He opened his mouth desperately, trying to formulate another excuse, another manipulation, another plea for a second chance. I did not give him the opportunity to speak. I leaned closer to the glass, making sure he could see the absolute victorious peace radiating from my eyes. I told him that he wanted a one-night stand with the boss. I told him that he got exactly what he asked for. I told him to enjoy the rest of his nights in this cell. I hung up the heavy black receiver, cutting off the audio feed entirely. I did not wait to see his reaction. I did not watch him sob or pound his cuffed hands against the glass. I picked up my briefcase, turned my back on the visitation booth, and walked away. The heavy steel security doors slid shut behind me, locking the past away forever. I stepped out of the federal detention center and into the bright, warm Atlanta sunlight. The crisp morning air hit my face, clean and refreshing. I took a deep, deliberate breath. The suffocating weight of Trevon's arrogance, his constant financial drains, and the toxic enabling hierarchy of his family had been entirely lifted from my shoulders. I felt lighter than I had in years. I felt fundamentally, undeniably free. I drove straight back to the financial district. When I arrived at the firm, the atmosphere was charged with a quiet, respectful energy. The successful takedown and total asset recovery of Vanessa's corrupt tech empire had elevated our agency's reputation to unprecedented heights within the federal oversight community. I walked past the rows of glass-walled cubicles, receiving nods of deep professional respect from the senior analysts and junior partners. I reached the executive suites and was immediately ushered into Elias' corner office. The managing partner was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the city skyline. He turned as I entered, a rare, genuine smile crossing his features. He did not slide a classified red dossier across his mahogany desk this time. He slid a sleek leather-bound contract. Elias told me that my execution of the shadow audit and my flawless management of the federal task force were the finest pieces of investigative work he had seen in his entire 30-year career. He stated that the firm needed leaders who possessed both brilliant analytical minds and absolute unshakable integrity under fire. He pointed to the contract resting on the polished wood. He informed me that the executive board had voted unanimously that morning. I was not just receiving a substantial bonus. I was being officially promoted to managing partner. My name was going on the glass doors of the executive suite. I signed the partnership agreement with a steady hand, securing a level of generational wealth and professional power that Trevon and his family could never even begin to comprehend. With my new financial status solidified, I immediately severed all remaining physical ties to my former life. I sold the suburban house where Trevon had lived. I did not want to inhabit a space tainted by his memory. Instead, I purchased a stunning modern architectural masterpiece, nestled in the quiet, heavily forested hills of Sandy Springs. The new house was a fortress of glass, natural stone, and dark wood flooded with natural sunlight and surrounded by towering pine trees. It was a private, luxurious sanctuary that belonged entirely to me. Nobody else held a key. Nobody else's opinions dictated the decor. It was a space completely devoid of toxic expectations. 6 months after the chaotic midnight confession that had shattered my world, I stood in the center of my brand new state-of-the-art chef's kitchen. The evening sky outside my massive windows was painted in deep, rich shades of violet and gold. The house was completely silent, but it was not a lonely silence. It was a rich, victorious, and hard-earned peace. I pulled a beautiful thick cut of wild-caught salmon from the refrigerator. I seasoned it perfectly with fresh herbs, garlic, and a touch of citrus. I seared it in a cast-iron skillet until the skin was perfectly crisp, the rich aroma filling the warm, inviting space of my new home. I plated the salmon on a brand new handcrafted ceramic dish, accompanying it with roasted asparagus and a glass of incredibly expensive, perfectly chilled white wine. I carried my plate to the edge of the massive marble kitchen island. I did not set a second place. I did not check my phone for incoming messages. I sat down on the plush leather bar stool, took a sip of the crisp wine, and picked up my fork. I took the first bite of the salmon. It was perfectly cooked, flavorful, and wonderfully hot. I closed my eyes, savoring the meal, savoring the silence, and savoring the beautiful, unbothered reality of a life rebuilt entirely on my